block buy contracting, and that is the ability to do these cross-class combined purchases of materials and components. That can achieve savings that would not be possible under multi-year procurement alone or under a similar provision that might be written into a block buy contract.
Well, thank you both for your testimony. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Before we go to Mr. Conaway, I just want to make sure we've got a good picture of what Mr. Courtney has just said. As we're looking right now, Mr. Rourke, as we put in the new authorities that we have in the National Sea-Based Deterrent Fund, we have had some individuals indicate to us that we could have savings anywhere between 5% or as much as 10% or so in that. Would you think that those estimates would be unreasonable to project?
Mr. Chairman,
Dr. Labs?
yes, the way I agree with the 5 to 10% range, and the way that works in the way the CBO sort of does the estimating process, sort of economic order quantity authority, which has been put into the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund, is going to give you somewhere in the neighborhood of a 5% savings because of the ability to sort of, as Mr. O'Rourke said, to buy components either jointly with other programs or just within the Ohio class replacement itself. Further authorities that would allow it to sort of do a block buy contract over, several ships of the class could get you another 5% and upwards in the 10% range. So if you're talking about a $6 billion submarine in round numbers, you're looking at a $300 to $600 million savings, per boat.
And if you're looking at a $100 billion program and you could save 10%, you're talking about roughly $10 billion.
Yes, sir.
Statement. So at a time when we are making enormous cuts in Army brigades, in readiness and strike fighter shortfalls and munitions shortfalls, all taking real pain to the warfighter, this is an opportunity for us to have a substantial savings without having to take that pain to the warfighter simply by setting up this fund. Would that be a fair statement to make?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And the last part on that before we go to Mr. Conaway is one of the downsides to that normally is the fear that we may not ultimately purchase all of those boats. But in this particular case, it's also another difference because we know we're going to be acquiring and building those 12 boats. Is that a fair statement?
The Navy has stated that the Ohio class replacement is their #1 priority, and the assumption is that will be funded before all other acquisition programs will be in the Department of the Navy.
Good. Mr. Conaway is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chairman. I listened to both of you on multiple occasions. It seems like we're constantly stuffing square pegs in round holes. If you could be dictator or king for a week and could eliminate all of this morass that you know so well, how would a proper acquisition program look like? I mean, we've got all this multi-year block grant, all this other kind of stuff that you talk about. All of that has been cobbled together over a number of years in responses to struggles and everything else. Cutting through all of that, and maybe this is a waste of time, but cutting through all of that, is there a better way to build this mousetrap than the current Rubik's Cube we currently put ourselves through?
Well, as you know, Eric and I can't make policy recommendations. That's prohibited by our agencies. But your question gets at the issues of lessons learned in shipbuilding and what are good ways of conducting shipbuilding programs and to some degree acquisition programs in general. It's my view that the lessons in shipbuilding have been identified quite thoroughly over the years. And the question has not been to identify those lessons, it has been to live up to them and to continue to implement them and not stray from them. And if I could give you a short list of what those lessons are, they've been mentioned over the years by many people, and I think they would be echoed to a large degree within the Acquisition Directorate of the Department of the Navy. It would be the following. There's 8 or 9 points here. The first would be to get the operational requirements for the program right up front so that you don't get into a situation of changing the requirements in the midst of the program. You would impose cost discipline up front by using realistic price estimates and consider not only development and procurement costs, but life cycle operation and support costs as well. Third point would be to employ competition where possible in the awarding of design and construction contracts. A fourth would be to use a contract type that is appropriate for the amount of risk involved and structure its terms to align incentives with desired outcomes. A fifth is to minimize design construction concurrency by developing the design to a high level of completion before starting construction and by resisting changes in requirements during construction. The next one is to properly supervise construction work by maintaining an adequate number of properly trained supervisor of shipbuilding or SUPSHIP personnel. And the final two are to provide stability for industry, in part by using, where possible, multi-year procurement or block buy contracting. And then lastly, to maintain a capable government acquisition workforce that understands what it is buying, as well as the points that I've just gone through. Again, these are points that people who have worked a long time in shipbuilding have mentioned over and over again over the years. The challenge is not identifying those points. It's living up to them.
Well, there's one thing to, and by the way, I'm impressed that you had that list handy like that. Because I just made up my question sitting here. It wasn't like you got any heads up. So, all right, the question of living up to it, what about the current legal structure, all the vast, the number of NDAAs that have been signed over the years, what about the current system that does not allow that, just mechanically keep you from being able to implement, or the system from being able to implement those best practices? Are there things that we should do differently or laws we should change to make that happen?
I think in connection with that, I will refer back to something that the Navy's own acquisition executive, Sean Stackley, I think, has said, which is that the first thing is to have good people in your acquisition workforce. And if they know what they're doing and they're knowledgeable and skilled in what they're doing, they can make the system work even if there are imperfections in that system. Whereas the opposite, or the obverse, is much more problematic. You could have a perfect system.
Yeah, but we intend to have both.
Right. You want to strive toward
and a system that works for them. So to your first point, if we put great people in place, they can make any system work. Well, that may be great as an exercise, but wouldn't it be better to have both really good people in place as well as a scheme that makes the most sense? And I know you can't make policy recommendations, but we don't do, every time we go through some sort of acquisition reform process, we never let it fix and bake enough before we start on the next round. But all your conversation you guys both went through seems incredibly difficult to get through all those hoops and get the ships that we need. So
the one thing I would add to Baran's answers, which were excellent, was that and he touched on it. I'm going to put a term on it, which is organizational culture. The culture of your acquisition organizations have got to be incentivized in a way that they're interested in getting things right. In other words, you don't sort of do unrealistic cost estimates, which are going to create any number of problems as the program evolves. That they're interested in sort of getting all the requirements right and the design right ahead of time. And to the extent that there is legislation, I don't know if there is, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an expert on acquisition reform, to the extent that you can sort of encourage those kinds of organizational imperatives within your acquisition directorates, I think that's all to the good.
I guess the frustration I have is that there seems to be no upside to folks in that business to take risks. Taking risks, if it works, great. If it doesn't work, you just get punished and beat to death. And so there's no upside to do that. And anyway, yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Conaway. Mr. Lynchman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of our witnesses for your testimony and the extraordinary work and contributions you're making to the committee in helping us to understand these challenges. I want to continue on the line of questioning Mr. Courtney had raised with the National Sea-Based Deterrent. In your statements, you both noted that the Ohio Replacement Program is the nation's #1 strategic priority, will have a significant impact on the Navy's 30-year shipbuilding plan if its effects aren't mitigated. So obviously, to help answer this, the Congress created the National Sea-Based Deterrent Fund, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to further explain how cost savings from this method of implementation would perhaps indirectly benefit other programs of interest to the Navy at risk due to the budgetary strain from recapitalizing our strategic deterrent.
In terms of the benefits of the mechanism and how they can help other programs as a result, there are two things that I would say. The first would be to reiterate my point earlier that there's now an authority within the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund that does not exist in the standard statute that governs multi-year procurement, and that's an authority to do combined purchases of materials and components across classes. So that legislation, which has just been enacted into law, provides a unique mechanism of savings that would be on top of the savings that you would get from using a block buy contract with EOQ authority, or a multi-year procurement contract with its automatic EOQ authority. How much more, I don't know exactly what the additional savings would be, but we're in a situation with a constrained defense top line where additional savings are, in general, a welcome thing because it can free up money for use in other programs. The other way in which you can mitigate the impact of this program on other Navy programs or on other DoD programs generally is by mitigating the budget spikes associated with the funding of each ship in the program. That's something that can be done through incremental funding if the Congress and the executive branch agree to do that. And this is something that is already used with aircraft carriers and LHA-type amphibious assault ships, and very much for that reason, so that you don't have to push programs to either side of that budget spike. When you do that to those other programs and you move them to the years before and after the spike, you can disrupt their procurement schedules, which can drive up their costs by causing instability in their production timelines. So if you can mitigate the spike that would otherwise force you to move those other programs to the side, you can preserve the production timelines a little better for those other programs and avoid the cost increases that would result from those disruptions.
To put a specific, the specific Ohio replacement example on that, in 2021, the Navy would currently plan to spend $7 billion in 1 year of buying the bulk of the lead Ohio replacement ship. There's procurement funding that occurs before that period, starting in 2017, but the plan is $7 billion in 2021. That's a big hunk of money to swallow in 1 year. So to the extent that the authorities, as Mr. O'Rourke said, can sort of help spread that out a little bit, it would make sort of planning and going back to the issue of stability something that helps other shipbuilding programs, or certainly the avoidance of higher costs in other shipbuilding programs.
If you wanted to do that in a very forward-leaning or even aggressive manner, it would be to pursue the revised procurement schedule that I've laid out in notional form in my testimony for starting the procurement boats, the procurement of the 12 boats earlier and maybe stretching it out at the end a little bit later. That would put more open years into the total procurement profile into which the incremental funding for those individual boats could be transferred, and would provide more opportunities for avoiding budget spikes than you have in the current schedule for the program.
Thank you. That's helpful. So let me look at it the other way. Conversely, if we fail to take advantage of the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund and force these costs on the Ohio Replacement Program to come out of the shipbuilding account, what would that mean for the Navy's ability to project power and remain technologically superior in the future?
Mr. Langevin, I have a section in the CBO report that discusses if the Navy is still constrained with the historical level of shipbuilding, $16 billion a year, and they must pay for the Ohio replacement, and I also include the aircraft carrier program in that, out of that first, and there's no cuts to those programs to sort of get the Navy shipbuilding top lines down into that historical level. What the result would be buying 192 ships over the 30-year period instead of 264. And that would lead you to a 237-ship Navy by 2045, instead of the 305-ship Navy that the Navy envisions in the plan. So cutting that many ships out of the shipbuilding program is going to substantially affect the amount of forward presence that the Navy can provide at any given time. It's going to substantially affect the number of ships that can be brought to bear in a conflict situation through the surge process that normally that the Navy would go through in those kinds of scenarios.
Another way of looking at it is this. We had a discussion earlier about what the savings would be just inside the Ohio replacement program if you could get a 10%, and the figure was in the billions of dollars. Another kinds of major combatants. So to get at your bottom line question, what would you lose? You could lose another 2 or 3 major Navy combatants.
Very, very powerful scenario. Thank you, and I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Hunter is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here and answering questions. I guess my question is on testing. So you've talked about buying the stuff to build the ships, the steel, all the cable and everything you need to build the ships. What about the integration portion, the testing portion?
That's the phase in construction where a lot of the cost growth in shipbuilding programs has been experienced in trying to bring everything together during the final stages. The testing can then discover further problems, but the history of cost growth in lead ship construction is one in which quite often a lot of that cost growth has occurred in the final stages when you're trying to integrate. And that's why the question of design stability becomes important potentially as a requirement, for example, for multi-year procurement, or more generally for the philosophy in shipbuilding, making sure that you get the design right and not trying to do too much with any one new design for a new class.
You wouldn't possibly have any numbers, would you, on what you think you could save if you could? Have you heard of the thing called automatic test retest, ATRT? Okay, it's a way that they test Aegis ships right now, and it's very simple. It takes a day versus 6 months. But anyway, so do you not have a number on how much savings it would be compared to the buying stuff savings, meaning the integration savings, the not changing things midway through? Meaning, if you could save 5% or 5 to 10%, talking about what you're talking about now, what could you save on?
I guess what I would say is that changing the design construction, concurrency, finding problems with the design because you did not bring it to a high state of completion before you started building it is a significant part of, significant contributor of the overall amount of cost growth that historically has been experienced on lead ships. I don't know what the fraction is, but it's probably a substantial fraction. And Eric has actually calculated historically what that total amount of cost growth has been for lead ships in recent decades.
Yeah, what we've seen for cost growth in lead ships in recent decades is about a 45% growth average overall of the last 30 years, or 27% growth on as a weighted average. But our data does not break it down to that level of detail, and I'm not even sure, as I sit here contemplating your question, how I would go about doing that calculation, because there's so much potential for idiosyncrasies and variability among the different shipbuilding programs. There's so many potential unknowns there. But I agree with the general thrust of your point that and what Mr. O'Rourke said, that to the extent that we can make the design stable and that things can be tested and avoid any changes at the last minute and so forth, you are going to have a more stable and less cost growth, if any at all.
Right. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Graham is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. Listening to you all, I hear that the issues associated with contracts and the structure of contracts can diminish the options, obviously, that we have with our shipbuilding plans. What other options? You mentioned extending, within the contractual language, extending the timeline for the buildings of the ships as one potential for being able to drive down cost. What are some other options where we could put in place a more flexible contract approach that would help with driving down some of the cost of shipbuilding, taking advantage of opportunities to help our shipbuilding program be more efficient and effective? And I have one more question, deals with flexibility as well, but totally different subject.
In terms of contracting options, the federal acquisition regulations give you two broad families of contracts that you can pursue. You can do cost reimbursement type contracts, or you can do fixed price contracts of one kind or another. And then there are variations that some people look at and say, well, they fall somewhere in between those two. Cost reimbursement contracts are kinds of contracts that for shipbuilding we try to get away from historically and to move as much as possible toward fixed price contracts. Within fixed price contracts, there's firm fixed price and there's fixed price incentive. And a lot of the shipbuilding programs have been done with fixed price incentive, where there is a target cost, a ceiling cost, and a line in between the two that determines how the government and the contractor will share the costs as you run from target up towards ceiling. And above ceiling, the contractor takes responsibility for everything. I think within that framework, there are innumerable specific combinations about what the slope of that share line looks like, or what allowable adjustments might be for the target cost or the ceiling cost. And there is actually a lot of flexibility that you have for building in the specific terms of the contract within that overall framework. I think what the Navy would say, what DoD would say, is that you should use that flexibility to wind up with a contract that aligns the incentives that the contract provides with your desired outcomes, so that you're not rewarding something that is not important to you, but that you are rewarding something that is important to you, like making a certain cost or meeting a certain schedule or quality or capability. So aligning the incentives that are bound into the contract with what you truly have as your desired outcome becomes the goal. And then after that, the devil is in the details, and there's innumerable permutations for what the guts of the contract can look like.
So is it, are they form contracts that are then modified for each, or are they individually drafted for the particular project?
The contracts tend to be negotiated program by program, and if the program is being pursued through annual contracting, then you have an annual contract for each year's, or more than one annual contract for each year's worth of procurement within that program.
I'm not sure I can improve upon what Mr. O'Rourke said.
Excellent. Thank you very much. My contract law is kind of coming back into my head a little bit. Scary, long time ago. Law school was a long time ago. Second question on flexibility issues. If you have one major piece of a ship, let's say a hull, for example, could you use that hull as the basis for a ship that performs multiple functions?
Yes, and the Navy has already been pursuing those types of strategies in the past. One of the things that the Navy has done is they have been evolving the DDG 51 program, for example, from the flight 1-2s to the flight 2, the flight 2A, and then the flight 3s, with the prospect that they may pursue that in their shipbuilding program, later on down the road. In the world of amphibious shipping, the LPD-17 hull form is something that we're completing the process of building 11 of those ships, with the 12th still to be started, and then we are now going to adapt that hull form for the LXR program, taking capability off that ship to reduce its cost, but still the basic hull is there. And conceivably, if the Navy chose to do so, that hull form could be used for other types of missions, whether you want to replace hospital ships or command ships or something else. You can reuse hulls for different purposes.
Yeah, there's actually a fair amount of history behind this. The Spruance-class destroyer became the basis for the Kidd-class destroyer, and also the Aegis cruiser that we have today. And the mobile landing platform ship more recently became the basis for the afloat forward staging base. The latter is essentially a modified version of the former. So there are multiple examples you can point to of hulls being reused and adapted to create specific new designs for ships that have slightly different mission orientations.
And to the extent that you can do more of that is going to be, on average, should be more cost effective than designing something new and fresh.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but again, I so appreciate you coming here today and helping us to understand in a more specifically, information-driven way that the issues that we face with funding these incredibly huge contracts and important projects for our military. So, thank you very much. Appreciate it. I know I'm way out of time. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Well, that's okay, Ms. Graham. Good questions. And as we look at all the questions that have been asked today, and we try to get an aerial view of them because each one of them are important, Mr. Conaway's question about what legally we can do to change the language, we certainly want to explore, because if we can do that, it's important. Mr. Hunter said about testing and those kind of things, if we can save dollars, we want to do it. Ms. Graham, your question's very important for us to look at, and of course, Mr. Courtney and Mr. Langevin looked at the Sea-Based Deterrent Fund. Let me put it in a picture maybe that we can give to our other policymakers in Congress. We've had testimony that if we reach about a level of 260 ships, we cease to be a superpower and we become a regional power. That's what some of our admirals have testified to. How many ships do we, and this is not a quiz for you like Mr. Conaway, I know we haven't given you the questions before, but how many ships do we currently have in the Navy today, if we started with just a number, best estimates you have?
273 today, sir.
So if we have 273 ships today, and we look at our 30-year, so we're basically 13 ships above that magical 260 ship line that would cause us significant problems. If we take the 30-year shipbuilding plan and we follow that plan to what the Navy would propose would be its conclusion, how many ships would we have at the end of that period of time?
305 ships in 2045.
So we would have 305 ships. Now, Dr. Labs, CBO has said, roughly, that there is a $4 billion delta between what they looked at as the average amount that the Navy had for shipbuilding over the last 30 years and between what it would take to do the shipbuilding plan that they have given to Congress. Is that a fair
Yes, sir.
representation?
About $4.5 billion would be the CBO number.
So to fill that $4.5 billion,
137 ships, not 305.
so then if we let things go just the way they are, and with the proposals that have been put in there, we will go in 30 years from 273 ships to 237 ships. And the shortfall between what even the Navy says, which we all recognize is lower than what a lot of analysts say we need, but you'd have the difference between 305 and 237 ships as the shortfall we would have in terms of ships, ship count. Fair?
Yes, sir, based on those assumptions, correct.
Now, one of the ways we can begin to close that gap, Mr. Courtney alluded to this earlier, is with the Sea-Based Deterrent Fund. And Mr. Rourke, you said it very properly. One of the things that we're doing with that fund is, if those numbers hold, instead of paying for 12, we would get 12, but we would pay for 11, and that could save us a substantial amount of money. The other thing, Mr. Rourke, you have at some time talked about the ability we could have would be to shift a small portion of the overall budget of the Department of Defense to build some of these ships. If we did that, what percentage would we be talking about that we would need to shift to be able to build the ships that we need over that 30-year period of time?
Shifting that $4.5 billion would equate to shifting less than 1% of the DoD base budget.
So if we shifted approximately 1% or less, then we could build all the ships that the Navy says that they need over that 30-year period of time. So the options, it seems to us, is to end up at the end of 30 years with 237 ships, one shift about 1% of the current Department of Defense budget, or adding additional dollars to the top line of the Navy for doing that shipbuilding if we want to build those ships. Fair argument on that? Mr. Conway, did you have another question?
Well, no, so the math is 30 years times 4.5. So $135 billion shortfall, and so where does this come from? And you were talking about the 10 billion here and 3 billion there and 5 billion there, but 135, then you don't get there. But you can't save your way into fixing this.
Can't save your way into
In terms of, you ought to do those things, but at the end of the day, building all these ships we plan to at less than what we thought they're going to cost still doesn't get you the 135 you need to make.
That's exactly right, and that's why we have to have a combination of these things if we want to get there. Mr. Rourke, the one last question I have for you: when we look at different services, they have different acquisition schemes, approaches that they use. For example, the Navy seems to make great use of multi-year procurement contracts on block buys, while the Air Force currently has no multi-year procurements. Can you give us any idea from your analysis why there's such a significant difference between the approaches of the various military services, and what do you believe drives those services towards different acquisition approaches?
I don't track the Air Force or the Army, so I really can't speak to detail about the other two services. But in terms of why the Navy makes extensive use of multi-year procurement and block buy contracting, I think a primary reason has to do with program stability. When you ask both the Navy and industry what is a foundation for success in shipbuilding, they will tell you that a big part of that foundation is stability. And so I know that the idea of program stability in all dimensions, funding stability, design stability, and so on, appears to be fairly central to their thinking. It is a starting point for them in thinking about how to have success in ship acquisition. And if that is a big part of their starting point, then it seems to me that it would only be natural for them to then think about multi-year procurement and block buy contracting for two reasons. One is that if you have a stable program, then the risks of using multi-year procurement and block buy contracting are less. And conversely, using those programs can then become a new and added dimension of stability in shipbuilding. So if the Navy is using multi-year procurement and block buy contracting a lot, which it is, it's using it currently for all three of its year-to-year shipbuilding programs. They account for almost 3/4 of all the ships in the Navy's 5-year shipbuilding plan. That's extraordinary, the amount of commitment that the Navy has to these contracting mechanisms. And I believe, as I look at the situation, that this is a reflection in both of those ways of how the Navy puts stability at the heart of its formula for how to achieve success in ship acquisition.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Rourke. Mr. Courtney had one final question.
Yeah, and actually, just to follow up on that last line of thought, and certainly the Navy has embraced multi-year procurement and incremental funding, but it's done it somewhat in tandem with Congress. I mean, when we acted in 2012 in the Virginia-class program to, create incremental funding, I mean, that 10 for the price of 9 Block 4 contract became possible. And so I just think that it's also good to underscore the fact that we gave the Navy the tools, and they've demonstrated that it works. And I think we've done it again with the Sea-Based Deterrence Fund. And Mr. Conaway's point is well taken, that by itself is not going to fix this problem. But certainly in terms of making the case to our colleagues and to the country that we're being smart buyers here, these approaches are definitely showing real tangible results that we can point to historically and empirically, and your reports did that. I don't know if you want to comment on that. I just wanted to, again, remind people that it was partly because of the 2012 NDAA that we got to some of those savings.
To underscore that, I think it's worth reiterating that every single use of multi-year procurement, every single use of block buy contracting was done with the approval, the positive approval of the Congress. The Navy, the services cannot do this except with congressional approval. And it was Congress that legislated the creation of the National Defense Sea Lift Fund back in the early 1990s. And it was also Congress, just within the recent past, within the last year or two, that did not agree with the idea of eliminating the National Defense Sea Lift Fund when that was a proposal that was part of the executive branch's budget submission for that year.
Gentlemen, you've both done incredible work to do this analysis. We thank you. I'd like to give you at this time an opportunity, if you need it, to do any kind of wrap-up to make sure you get on the record what we need to get on the record based on your work. So why don't we start with you, Mr. Rourke, and we'll end as we started with Dr. Labs.
I have one wrap-up point, as it were, which is that even though we have talked a lot today about the Ohio Replacement Program and the ability to use contracting mechanisms and incremental funding to save money in that program is not the only Navy shipbuilding program where there are opportunities of this kind. My testimony goes through all of the opportunities that I can identify in one form or another, and indeed the list I come up with encompasses every one of the Navy's principal shipbuilding programs, either as a continuation of what you're already doing or as a new opportunity because it's a new start program. So it's important to understand what these mechanisms can do for the Ohio Replacement Program, but you don't want to assume that that's the only place where you can do these things. You can do block buys and eventually multi-years on things like the TAOX program and the LXR program. You can even think about doing a 2-ship block buy on the LHA program. So I would underscore going through the list of opportunities and candidate programs that it forms the back half of my testimony, because it certainly includes the Ohio program and talks more about that program than any other, but it talks about virtually all of the other principal Navy shipbuilding programs as well.
And that's a good point, because as Mr. Conaway said, the math is the math, and as Mr. Courtney pointed out, you're going to have to get there with a combination of means, but $10 billion here and $10 billion there starts adding up to real dollars. And also when you start shifting some of the top line of Department of Defense or maybe adding a little bit more, it helps get us closer to home. So Dr. Labs, we're going to let you have the last word.
Well, the only thing I would add to what both Mr. O'Rourke said and what I've said earlier is that going back to this question of sort of stability under the Budget Control Act, the Budget Control Act and the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015 has provided a fair amount of stability for the Department of Defense top line. But that is at the top line. Underneath that top line, there is no stability guaranteed to the shipbuilding accounts or any other number of accounts. That is something that is a choice that is made underneath that line by the administration and ultimately by the Congress. So to the extent that the stability that is provided by the BCA with the Bipartisan Budget Act does not ensure that shipbuilding is going to be funded to levels that maybe that you might desire, that is something that is still going to have to be actively done by the policymakers.
Well, thank you all. If we have nothing else, then we are adjourned. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you did too, and I think our testimony worked well.
Very complimentary.